The lost cabin in the woods. The drive into the wilderness seemed endless, the dense trees pressing closer with each mile. For friends, Emily, Jack, Lauren, and Ryan were packed into Jack's aging SUV, the scent of pine filling the cabin through the cracked windows. They had planned this trip for weeks, craving a break from their monotonous city lives. Emily, the organizer, had found the listing for the secluded cabin online. It was advertised as off the grid, nestled deep in nature's embrace, perfect for a weekend of disconnecting. The gravel road that led them deeper into the woods felt like a boundary between their regular lives and something unknown. Emily sat in the passenger seat, map in hand, glancing nervously at the narrowing path ahead. "Are you sure we're not lost?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jack smirked, tapping the GPS screen that flashed an unhelpful, no-signal message. "Relax, Em. This is the adventure we wanted, remember?" Ryan, ever the joker, leaned forward from the back seat. "If we end up in one of those true crime podcasts, I'm blaming you," he said, nudging Lauren, who rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a nervous smile. The trees thickened, their shadows stretching as the afternoon sun dipped lower. When they finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than expected. Its weathered wood and moss-covered roof hinted at years of neglect. A wide porch with sagging steps faced a clearing, and beyond it, the forest seemed impenetrable. The air was thick, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and soil. They unpacked quickly, hauling bags of food, blankets, and a cooler filled with drinks inside. The interior was sparse but functional, a small kitchen, a single bathroom, and a living area with mismatched furniture. An old fireplace dominated one wall, and a few dusty shelves held faded books and peculiar trinkets. Lauren wandered to the window, peering out at the looming trees. "It's cozy," she offered hesitantly. Jack dropped a duffel bag on the couch, grinning. "It's perfect. We'll light a fire, crack open some beers, and forget about work for a couple of days." As night fell, the forest came alive with unfamiliar sounds. The cabin's isolation, thrilling in daylight, now felt suffocating. They gathered in the living room, the flickering fire casting long shadows. Emily couldn't shake a sense of unease. She chalked it up to her overactive imagination, but the stillness outside seemed too deliberate, too heavy. The first night passed uneventfully, but as they drifted to sleep, the distant sound of something moving in the woods reached Emily's ears. She told herself it was just an animal. She didn't know how wrong she was. Emily awoke to the sound of the wind brushing against the cabin, though it felt like something more. The night was suffocatingly quiet, except for an occasional rustle that seemed to come from just outside. She lay still, listening, her eyes tracing the faint outline of the ceiling beams in the dark. The fire in the living room had long died out, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. She finally slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lauren, who had fallen asleep beside her. The floor creaked underfoot as she tiptoed to the window. Parting the curtain just enough to peek outside, she saw nothing but the trees swaying in the dim light. But then, she froze. Something felt off, like the shadows weren't just moving with the wind but shifting independently. Morning came with heavy gray clouds overhead, and Emily was the first to step outside. The air was crisp, and the damp earth squelched under her sneakers. She wandered to the edge of the clearing, her unease from the night before still lingering. There, in the mud, she noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading toward the cabin. They were large, too large to belong to any of them, and they stopped abruptly a few feet from the porch. "Hey, Em. Breakfast is ready," Jack called from inside, breaking her concentration. She hesitated for a moment before heading back in. Over pancakes and coffee, she debated whether to mention what she'd seen but decided against it. The last thing she wanted was to be the one to ruin the weekend. The group spent the day hiking the nearby trails, marveling at the forest's untouched beauty. Jack took the lead, his confidence infectious, while Ryan lagged behind, snapping photos and cracking jokes. Lauren collected wildflowers, tying them into little bouquets that she carried like treasures. Emily tried to shake the sense of being watched, but the feeling clung to her like a second skin. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows that made the woods look even more foreboding. They lit the fireplace and settled in for a cozy evening. Jack brought out a deck of cards, and soon the room was filled with laughter and playful banter. But as the night deepened, the mood shifted. Emily couldn't help glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone, or something, staring back. Around midnight, the group decided to call it a night. Emily lingered by the fire, staring into the glowing embers. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint tapping sound. It was so soft she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, like knuckles rapping against wood. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the front door. The tapping at the door continued, rhythmic and deliberate, cutting through the stillness of the night. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as she sat frozen, her gaze fixed on the dark wood of the cabin's entrance. It could have been the wind, she told herself, or maybe an animal drawn to the warmth inside. But the pattern of the sound felt too intentional, too human. Slowly, she stood and approached the door. Her fingers hovered over the deadbolt, hesitant. Her breath fogged up the small window on the door as she leaned closer to peek outside. Nothing but the shadows of the forest greeted her, their swaying motion eerily synchronized. The tapping stopped abruptly, as if it had never been there. The silence felt heavier than the noise. Emily backed away from the door and turned to go wake the others. That's when she noticed it. The flowers Lauren had gathered earlier were scattered across the floor, their delicate petals crushed and smeared as if trampled underfoot. Emily's stomach churned. She hurried to the bedrooms, calling out for her friends. Jack emerged first, rubbing his eyes and looking irritated. "What's going on?" he muttered. "Something's not right," Emily whispered, pointing toward the living room. The others joined them, their faces pale and alert. They followed Emily to the door, where Jack boldly opened it, stepping onto the porch. The cold air bit at their skin as they all peered into the darkness. The forest stood silent, but Emily felt certain they weren't alone. Jack shook his head, trying to laugh it off. "Probably a raccoon or something," he said, though his voice wavered. As they returned inside, Lauren knelt to gather her ruined flowers, her hands shaking. "Who would do this?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. No one answered. The group stayed in the living room that night, pulling their sleeping bags around the fire. No one admitted to being scared, but the tension in the air was palpable. Ryan, trying to lighten the mood, told a ghost story, but it fell flat. Every creak of the cabin, every flicker of the fire, made them jump. Sometime after 3 in the morning, Emily was jolted awake by the sound of a distant scream. It was faint, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. She sat up, her heart pounding, and looked at her friends. They were all awake, their eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" Ryan whispered. No one answered. Jack stood and grabbed the flashlight. "We should check it out," he said, though his face betrayed his uncertainty. "Are you insane?" Lauren snapped. "We stay inside. Together." But Jack was already at the door. He paused, his hand on the knob, and glanced back at them. "If someone's out there, they might need help," he said. Emily hesitated, then grabbed her coat. "I'll go with you," she said. The others protested, but she couldn't shake the thought that the scream might belong to someone in danger. The two stepped into the cold night, their breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The forest seemed to close in around them as they followed the direction of the sound. Every crack of a branch underfoot made Emily flinch, her nerves raw. They reached the edge of a small clearing, and Jack stopped abruptly. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. Emily squinted. At the center of the clearing was something unnatural, a crude wooden structure that looked like a cross between a shrine and a trap. Dangling from its beams were twisted ropes and fragments of clothing. Jack motioned for Emily to stay behind him as he stepped closer to the structure. The clearing was eerily silent, the usual rustle of leaves and calls of night creatures absent. The crude shrine loomed in the beam of their flashlight, its shadows stretching and twisting like living things. Emily couldn't help but feel they were trespassing on something ancient and sacred, or cursed. As Jack circled the structure, Emily noticed the markings carved into the wood. Strange, looping symbols covered every surface, unlike anything she'd ever seen. Some resembled letters, others grotesque figures contorted in impossible ways. The fragments of clothing tied to the ropes fluttered faintly in the breeze, as if beckoning her closer. "These markings," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're not random. Someone spent a lot of time on this." Emily's breath hitched as her flashlight beam caught something at the base of the shrine, a small pile of charred bones. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed Jack's arm for support. He followed her gaze and stiffened. "What is this place?" she murmured. Before Jack could answer, the air shifted around them. It wasn't a sound, exactly, more like the absence of sound, a vacuum that pressed against their eardrums. Emily felt her heart racing as she turned her head, certain they were being watched. "Jack, we need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. But Jack didn't respond. His flashlight beam had landed on something else, a torn, blood-stained piece of fabric hanging from one of the ropes. It looked disturbingly familiar. "That's Ryan's jacket," Jack whispered. Emily felt a wave of nausea. "No, it can't be. He's back at the cabin. We left him there." Jack's face was pale as he reached out and touched the fabric, his fingers trembling. The instant he did, the forest seemed to come alive. A deafening roar erupted around them, a sound like wind, but layered with whispers and cries that didn't belong to the living. "Run!" Jack yelled, grabbing Emily's hand. They sprinted back toward the cabin, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly in the darkness. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more distinct. Emily thought she could make out words, her name, repeated over and over in voices that sounded like a terrible mimicry of her friends. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both out of breath and shaking. Emily slammed the door behind them and locked it, her hands fumbling with the deadbolt. "What happened?" Lauren demanded, rushing into the room. Jack tried to speak, but no words came out. He collapsed onto the couch, his face buried in his hands. Emily, still trembling, managed to recount what they'd seen. The mention of Ryan's jacket sent a wave of panic through the group. "Where is he?" Lauren asked, her voice rising. "He's in his room," Emily said, though doubt crept into her mind. They all hurried to Ryan's door and knocked. No answer. Jack pushed the door open, and the room was empty. The window was ajar, curtains billowing softly in the night breeze. Lauren let out a choked sob. "He was just here. He was sleeping when we left the room." The group stood in silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. "What if?" Emily began, but she couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Jack said, though his voice was devoid of conviction. "We'll find him." But deep down, Emily knew that whatever had happened to Ryan was tied to the shrine. And she feared they were all part of its story now. The cabin felt colder, darker than it had just hours before. Emily, Jack, Lauren, and Sam huddled in the living room, the oppressive silence between them filled only by the occasional creak of the aging structure. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind outside like a whisper meant only for them. Ryan's absence weighed heavily on the group. His phone was still in the cabin, discarded on the bedside table, and no one had heard him leave. Lauren paced the floor, chewing her thumbnail to the quick, while Jack stared out the window, gripping a fire poker as if expecting an attack. "We can't just sit here," Emily finally said, breaking the silence. Sam shook his head. "And do what? Wander into the woods at night? After what you two saw? That's insane." "He could be out there," Lauren snapped. "Hurt, lost, or worse." Jack turned from the window. "We need to stick together. If we split up, we'll end up like him." Emily's stomach churned. Like him? What do you mean by that? Jack hesitated before answering. I don't think Ryan just wandered off. Something's out there, and it's playing with us. As if on cue, the whispers started again, low, barely audible at first, but rising steadily until they filled the room. Emily's blood ran cold as she recognized the voices, Ryan, calling her name, Lauren's sobs, Jack's panicked shouts. It was as though the cabin had become a radio, tuned into their deepest fears. Make it stop! Lauren cried, clamping her hands over her ears. Sam bolted upright. It's coming from the walls. Jack swung the fire poker at a spot near the fireplace where the whispers seemed loudest. The plaster cracked and crumbled, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a bundle wrapped in an old, stained cloth. What the hell is that? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. Jack hesitated, then reached in and pulled out the bundle. As soon as he touched it, the whispers ceased, plunging the cabin into an eerie, suffocating silence. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal an old leather-bound book, its cover marked with the same symbols they'd seen on the shrine. This doesn't feel right, Lauren murmured, stepping back. Emily leaned closer, her curiosity battling her fear. What is it? Jack opened the book, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and sketches. The ink was faded but legible, the language a mix of English and something far older. He flipped to a page with a detailed drawing of the shrine. Below it were the words, "The gateway must remain closed." Gateway? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jack scanned the text. It talks about a ritual. To summon something, or keep it contained. It's not clear. The room seemed to darken around them, the air growing heavier. Emily's chest tightened as if the cabin itself were pressing in on her. Put it back, Lauren said suddenly. Whatever it is, it's not ours to mess with. Jack ignored her, flipping to another page. This one depicted a figure, tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow Emily no matter where she stood. This thing, Jack said, pointing to the sketch. It's what we saw in the clearing. It's connected to Ryan. The group stared at the book in grim silence. Then, the lights flickered. The temperature dropped further, their breaths visible in the icy air. A deep, guttural sound echoed from the woods outside, sending a jolt of terror through them. Emily grabbed Jack's arm. We need to get out of here. Now. But before anyone could move, the front door slammed open, revealing the darkness beyond. A shadow stepped into the doorway, its shape unmistakable. Ryan. Or at least, something wearing his face. The figure at the door was unmistakable. Ryan's broad shoulders filled the doorway, but there was something wrong. His face, once warm and familiar, was hollow, his eyes dark and sunken, like a person who had seen too much, or worse, something that had returned from where it should never be. Ryan? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a cautious step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. Ryan didn't respond. His lips, once so full of life, were now a thin line, twisted in something that looked like contempt or sorrow, but it was impossible to tell. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thicker, the temperature dropping even further, until it felt as though the very life had been sucked out of the room. Jack took a step back, his hand gripping the book tightly. This isn't him, he murmured. This isn't Ryan. The figure in the doorway raised a hand, its long fingers twitching as though trying to beckon them closer. The shadowy figure, or whatever it was, moved with unnatural slowness, like something in a dream. It was almost as if Ryan's body was still there, but something had taken over, something older, something malevolent. Lauren shuddered. He's gone. Whatever's standing there is not our friend. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into darkness for what felt like an eternity. The sound of heavy breathing filled the space, but it wasn't just from them. Something else was there, something they couldn't see but could feel, lurking, waiting for them to make a mistake. And then it spoke. Leave. Ryan's voice came through the figure's mouth, but it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, like it was being pulled through thick water. The words echoed in the cabin, reverberating against the walls until they rattled. Emily froze. Leave? Why? What is this? She could barely get the words out, her throat tight with fear. The figure didn't move, but something in the air shifted. The pressure, the feeling of suffocation, seemed to intensify. And that's when Emily saw it. Behind the figure, in the dim light of the cabin, were shadowy shapes swirling. They were formless, like smoke, but they moved with purpose. There were too many of them to count, and they were closing in. "It's coming for us," Jack said, his voice shaking. He glanced down at the book. "We need to finish what's in here. It's the only way to stop it." "What do you mean?" "Finish what?" Emily asked, panic rising in her chest. "How do we stop this?" Jack flipped through the pages rapidly, scanning the ancient text. "We have to break the circle. The ritual, it's still in progress. We were never supposed to interrupt it. But if we close it, we can stop whatever this is." As he spoke, the room seemed to close in around them, the shadows pressing against their bodies, the temperature dropping until they could see their breath in front of them. The entity that was once Ryan stepped forward, its eyes locked onto Emily's. There was no warmth, no recognition, only the cold, empty gaze of something that had long since passed the point of being human. "We can't let him get any closer," Lauren said, her voice breaking. "What do we do?" Emily, still frozen in place, reached for the book in Jack's hands. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the shadows recoiled, as though something in the book repelled them. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed the door shut, and the temperature spiked, leaving them gasping for air. Jack gritted his teeth and turned to face the entity. "We have to finish the ritual," he said, his voice steely with resolve. "No." The air inside the cabin felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on them. Sophie stood frozen in the corner, her flashlight trembling in her hands as the beam danced across the dusty walls. "What is that sound?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic thudding. Liam pressed his ear against the door leading to the basement, his jaw tightening as he concentrated. The sound was unmistakable, a heartbeat. It was slow, deliberate, and far too loud to belong to any living creature. "Don't open it," Sophie begged, backing away toward the kitchen. But curiosity, or perhaps something more sinister, had already taken hold of Liam. "We need to know what's down there," he muttered, his hand gripping the rusted doorknob. As the door creaked open, an icy gust of air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. The beam of his flashlight illuminated a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Each step seemed to groan under the weight of some unseen force, daring them to proceed. "Stay here," Liam instructed Sophie, but she shook her head vehemently. "If you're going, I'm coming with you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The descent was slow, each step amplifying the oppressive silence. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight revealed a small, stone-walled room. In the center was a table, and on it lay an object wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. Sophie hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to flee, but Liam stepped forward, unwrapping the cloth. Beneath it was a book, ancient and bound in cracked leather, its surface engraved with unrecognizable symbols. The air seemed to grow colder as Liam opened it, revealing pages filled with cryptic writings and sketches that seemed to shift under the light. Suddenly, the heartbeat stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, a low growl echoed through the room, and the shadows along the walls began to twist and writhe as if alive. "Run!" Sophie screamed, grabbing Liam's arm and pulling him toward the stairs. But the shadows were faster. One lunged at them, its shape fluid and monstrous. They barely made it to the top, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a chair. Panting and trembling, they stared at each other, the weight of what they'd seen sinking in. "That book," Sophie whispered, "it's not meant to be here." Liam nodded, his face pale. "We need to destroy it." Back in the living room, they placed the book on the coffee table, unsure of their next move. Sophie suggested burning it, but Liam hesitated. "Books like this don't just burn," he said, recalling the stories his grandmother used to tell about cursed objects and the dangers of meddling with them. The atmosphere grew tense as they debated. Sophie kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see those shadowy figures watching them from the woods. Liam, meanwhile, thumbed through the pages, trying to make sense of the writings. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a page that depicted a crude drawing of a cabin surrounded by trees. Beneath it, a phrase in Latin was etched, the ink faded but legible. "Do you know what this means?" he asked Sophie. She shook her head. "I barely passed Spanish. It says, to awaken is to doom the soul. This cabin, it's part of something much bigger." Before Sophie could respond, a loud crash came from the kitchen. They both jumped, grabbing whatever they could use as weapons, a fireplace poker for Liam and a heavy candlestick for Sophie. The crash turned out to be a shattered jar of preserves that had fallen from the shelf, but as they stood in the kitchen, they heard whispers. They weren't coming from outside or even the basement. They were coming from the book. The whispers grew louder, forming words in a language neither of them understood. Liam slammed the book shut, but the voices didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to seep into the room, filling every corner with their eerie chant. "We need to leave," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "No." But as they reached for the front door, it wouldn't budge. The locks were disengaged, yet the door felt as though it were welded shut. The windows, too, resisted their attempts to open them. "We're trapped," Liam said, his voice tinged with panic. Just then, the book flew open on its own, its pages flipping wildly before settling on a sketch of two figures that looked eerily like Sophie and Liam. The sketch seemed to move, the figures' eyes shifting to meet theirs. Sophie screamed, throwing a blanket over the book, but the image remained burned into her mind. Liam grabbed a lighter from the fireplace mantel, determined to destroy the book despite his earlier hesitation. "If it doesn't burn, we'll find another way," he said through gritted teeth. As he held the flame to the cover, the book let out a piercing scream, like metal scraping against metal. The fire sputtered out, leaving the book untouched. "What now?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Liam's eyes darted around the room, landing on a map hanging near the door. It was a map of the surrounding forest, marked with trails and landmarks. Near the edge of the map was a symbol identical to one they'd seen in the book. "There," he said, pointing to the symbol. "Whatever's happening, it's tied to that place." Reluctantly, Sophie agreed to venture into the forest. Armed with flashlights and whatever tools they could find, they left the cabin, the oppressive atmosphere following them like a shadow. The trail was overgrown and difficult to navigate, but they pressed on, guided by the faint sound of whispers that seemed to lead them. The air grew colder, the trees more twisted, as if the forest itself were alive and trying to deter them. When they finally reached the spot marked on the map, they found a circle of stones surrounding a small, decrepit altar. On it lay an object identical to the book in the cabin. "This is it," Liam said, his voice shaking. As they approached, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and the whispers grew deafening. Shadows emerged from the trees, surrounding them in a circle. Sophie clung to Liam, her heart pounding. "What do we do?" she cried. Liam placed the book on the altar and recited the Latin phrase from memory. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. The book and the altar began to glow, and for a moment, it seemed as though they'd succeeded. But just as quickly as the light appeared, it vanished, replaced by darkness so complete that they could no longer see each other. And then, a voice, deep, resonant, and terrifying, spoke from the void, "You have awakened me." The ground gave way beneath them, and they fell into darkness, their screams swallowed by the void.